How bad is this problem, women in economics? Hotter, pregnant, plough, marry, and hot. These are the 5 words that were most commonly used to describe women on a website called Economics Job Market Rumours, and this was discovered by a Berkeley economics student called Alice Wu, who in her research looked at the word frequencies that were used on the website to describe men and women. And she concluded, a closer look into the contrast between the top female and top male terms reveals that women are more likely to be characterised by their physical appearance or personal information, whereas men are more associated with academic or work-related content. And the website is moderated, so this was post-moderated language. And there's a brief furore in the profession when Justin Wolfers, who's a leading American economist, publicised this work in the New York Times. And some economists said, you shouldn't take this seriously because this is just economics PhD students letting off steam at a very tense time in their lives when they're looking for jobs. It shouldn't be taken to represent the wider profession. And others, including I would say most female academic economists, recognised a manifestation, even if it was quite an extreme one, of a culture that they have often experienced in their working lives. So as Sarah was saying, economics is one of the most male-dominated academic disciplines. It's up there with engineering, computer science, physics, and philosophy. And I'll come back a bit later to what these subjects might have in common. And the figures are absolutely shocking. There is no gender bias in people's interest in the fundamental questions that we look at in economics. What makes people better off? Why did inequality increase so much after the 1980s? How do innovations occur and spread into daily use? What government policies improve people's health outcomes or education outcomes? There's no gender bias and interest in those questions. And although there's been some improvement since the 1970s in the proportion of women studying economics at university it's just under 30% now in the UK, it's very similar in the US and some other countries. But that trend seems to have come to an end, and it might even be going into reverse. And the proportion then declines at every stage, so from school to undergraduate to graduate study into the workplace, the proportion of women declines. In academia, it's at every stage in seniority. So in the most junior grades in the academic departments, maybe 2 in 5 people will be women. When you get to professors, it's only now about 1 in 6. And the situation is pretty bad in other contexts as well, like the city or in consultancy, and the one honourable exception to that, where they get to 30%, is the government economics service. And it's going to struggle as well in future if the pipeline is shrinking, if the proportion of students who are female doing economics is declining. And it might be getting worse, so there's an improvement for a few cohorts, but the signs are that fewer young women now are choosing economics, despite all the fascinating things that are happening in the world that we study. So why does this bias matter? Because all subjects at university have some kind of gender bias. And so one question is, why is economics so extreme? Let me just give them a minute. So I think everybody's gone now. So why is economics like this? And also, why do we care? But we don't worry about the underrepresentation of men in psychology or English literature. So I'll come back to the why economics question a bit later and start with why it matters. And the answer is that economics is powerful. For instance, there's a government chief economist. Actually, the new holder of the post is a woman, which is great. And there are a few similar expert roles in government. We have an astronomer royal, who one feels ought to wear a flowing gown and a pointy hat, but is a very nice man. There's a chief scientist and a chief medical officer, who's been a woman. We also have a chief poet, a poet laureate, so that's a bit of an exception. But there's no chief anthropologist or chief historian, no chief philosopher, no chief geographer in government. And in the corridors of power, economics ranks with the so-called hard sciences and poetry. So economics is really powerful in this very direct way. Economists are influencing policy every day in this role in government, and more broadly have a really significant action on government actions that affect every corner of our lives. And that's true around the world, it's not just here in the UK. So any policy proposal is assessed on whether it's good or bad for the economy, and economists get to decide. their say-so is treated as especially important in deciding whether to tax the sugary drinks that are rotting children's teeth, or what the limit on fixed odds betting terminals ought to be, or how much the government should be investing in scientific research. And of course it's politics in the end that makes the decision, and there are lots of voices and lobbying in these debates, but the politicians want to have an economist giving their decision authority, and people are always asking, is it good for the economy or not? Economics is also powerful in less obvious ways. So, for example, it can tunnel through mountains. Financial economics shaped the derivatives markets that paved the way for high-frequency trading, where computers trade with each other as close to the speed of light as they can get down fibre optic cables. Financial economics came up with the equation for pricing derivatives, before which the markets didn't exist because nobody knew what to charge for them, and it was all very tailored, and then the public markets became possible. So the whole derivatives explosion and the high-frequency trading came about because of an economic formula. And now financial traders are spending hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds to tunnel through the Allegheny Mountains between Chicago and New York, or to build huge microwave towers in the southeast of England in order to shave literally milliseconds off the speed at which orders are executed, because they can make so much money by doing it just that tiny bit faster. More subtly, economics really changes how we think about the world. What do we see? How do we understand it? It even defines what we think of as constituting the economy. And so everything the government does, so many of our collective decisions about how to order society are debated in terms of GDP. It's a favourite subject of mine, and I've written a rather good book about it if you feel like buying it later. So it's our key measure of the economy, and everybody knows by now, I think, that GDP, gross domestic product, doesn't include unpaid work in the home that's traditionally been done by women. And when it was invented during and after World War II, there was a debate about whether or not this should be included or excluded, as there was actually about whether or not to include or exclude government spending. And this debate hinged on whether GDP was going to measure only transactions in the market with money exchanged and able to be taxed, or whether instead it should be a wider concept of economic well-being or value. In the end, government spending got included because in wartime, the last thing anybody wanted was for it to look like the government's military spending was making people worse off, even if it was. So government got included, but work in the home was excluded. And so now, and ever since then, what governments and businesses do is the economy, and what happens inside the household is not. Even though people are constantly making decisions about whether to make their own dinner, or buy a meal out, or whether to buy a washing machine or go to the laundrette, whether to do things inside the house and not pay money for them, or whether to do them in the market and pay money for them. And since about 2 years ago, we have the really absurd situation that statistical agencies like the Office for National Statistics have to include marketed but illegal activities like illegal drugs transactions and prostitution in GDP, whose growth is taken as the main measure of whether or not we're getting better off. But looking after your family or voluntary care in your community doesn't count towards that measure, which is just absurd. From time to time there are surveys about what people do in the home, how much leisure, how much volunteering, how much childcare and gardening, and so on. And these are called time-use surveys, and when you apply to them the value of wages that people get for doing those activities in the market, it's always roughly as big as the official economy. So this is a lot of activity. But apart from those very infrequent time-use surveys and some other specially commissioned data sets that a lot of economic research gets done on, there's a lack of sort of regular information, regular statistics that are essential for good social policies. So information like who's caring for children and elderly dependents and what that implies for public services, or what the living standard of more than half of pensioners, the women, is likely to be. That would be really useful information to have. But the statistical agencies spend very little of their budget on collecting statistics that are nothing to do with GDP. Another consequence of this decision about what economists call the production boundary, with government and businesses on one side and work in the household on the other, is that the apparent growth of the economy in the mid-20th century was rather exaggerated by the fact that women were increasingly not working in the home, giving up their jobs when they got married, but working in the market, working in paid employment instead. And that increased the GDP growth figures. So women were going out to work and buying the washing machines and the microwaves, so buying the consumer durables, buying the ready meals, paying people to do some of the cleaning and gardening, and marketed activities were replacing some of the non-marketed ones. This is now going into reverse a bit with the digital technologies. And they're sending activities out of the market and back into the home. So a little bit of apparently dismal growth in the economy now may be due to this transition back in the other direction. For example, people are doing more of their own travel agency and banking. They're still spending some money with an intermediary, but they're doing more of that activity themselves. They're creating free online goods and services, whether it's open source software or cute cat videos for people's entertainment on YouTube. They're participating in digital platforms to rent out spare bedrooms or driveways or exchange dog walking and so on. Now, a lot of men are doing these things, and digital is very whiz-bang and exciting. So there's a new interest in this measurement question, which is one of the areas of my research. But not enough yet on asking what does the measurement actually make visible and invisible to us? Because we think we measure what we see, but actually we see what we measure. And this is why it matters that the study of the economy is so male-dominated, because social science explores how we see ourselves. What questions do we even ask about how society is ordered and who gets what, the allocation of resources, which is at the heart of economics? What evidence do we bother to gather, and what do we think matters? So we have a very gendered society, and women and men see different things and have different experiences. And so just as it matters that medicine in the past has largely addressed the male body and its needs, it matters that economics is largely done by men and therefore for men. And the results are going to fail half the population in some way. So male researchers do excellent work on taxes and the labour market and pensions and interventions in education, but there are questions and incentives and behaviours that won't even cross their minds because the choices available to them are different from those available to women. The preferences may be different, the risk attitudes may be different in different contexts. So to give a couple of examples about how experience matters. Me Too. Many men, I think, were truly shocked at the revelations about the behaviour of some men in the workplace and about how pervasive sexual harassment to different degrees has turned out to be at work. But I don't think all that many women will have been completely surprised by it. Very few men behave like that, but very many women have experienced some behaviour of that kind. Another example was the switch to working families tax credit under the new Labour government in 1999. And the new system was seen as a big improvement for two reasons. It concentrated the money that was being spent on lower income families, and it created a stronger incentive to work because it was linked to having a job. But the preceding benefit, family credit, was paid to all mothers. It was paid to the women. And the tax credits mainly went to the fathers. And even the wives and partners of very well-off men value the independence, the psychology almost, that comes with having some income of their own. And that distribution of power and money within the household wasn't part of the policy thinking at all. But economics is a social science, and to the extent that economists aren't representative of society, they're going to be doing their job badly. So that's why I think it matters. And I want to talk about why I think economics is so male-biased. As soon as you start to make some links between economics and power, you have the start of an answer to that question. In the former Soviet Union, most economists were women. And the reason that it was a female-dominated profession there was not because it was socialist nirvana of female empowerment, but because the job of being an economist involved setting prices for tractor tyres in factories east of Urals. It was a very low-status job, and there were lots and lots of economists. So, status and power are part of the story. But that's a bit abstract, and why specifically in economics today, in universities today, in the UK and the US and France and similar countries, do men make up 70% or more of the profession? Now, there are some conventional explanations, and I think they're very obviously wrong. Economics has become very mathematical during the course of my career, and it used to be said that the fact that you have to be good at maths to do an economics degree puts lots of girls off. And actually there are a lot more boys than girls who do maths at A-level. But the girls who do it get better results on average than the boys, and there are more, there's a high proportion of women doing maths degrees than there are women doing economics degrees. And when girls do maths A-level, they get better results. So I don't think that argument stands up at all. And some of the recent research indicates that economics departments make offers in the same proportion to boys and girls, and even within economics, the girls have better A-level results. A variation on that was a question raised by an old colleague of mine, Larry Summers, which caused absolute outrage in 2005, and he's a pretty good guy at causing absolute outrage, whatever he does. He asked whether different distributions of aptitude in maths between men and women might be part of the explanation for the underrepresentation of women in science and engineering, not specifically economics. He said that men and women could be equally talented on average, but the distribution of talent among men might be wider, so there are more men who are really good and more men who are really bad. And he suggested that the sciences would put a premium on the most talented people who would be disproportionately male if those distributions were correct. Now, some of the women listening to his talk, he was president of Harvard at the time and he resigned afterwards, some of the women listening walked out because they were very offended. Some of the women thought it was okay to ask the question. All of the men thought it was okay to ask the question, and that it was an acceptable thing to raise. And as far as one can tell from the press reports at the time, the men didn't understand the outrage on the part of some of the women. So I think the question still stands, but obviously that is something for which we have almost no underlying evidence. And if you're looking at the averages, then the maths explanation won't stack up. Another potential explanation is about role models and the absence of role models. If only one in 5 women are economists, then there are not going to be so many women acting as role models. The talking heads on television, they're all men. So this is a bit harder to assess, and it might play a part. A recent study found that in an experiment, when students were randomly assigned in their first year in college to groups that had a male teacher and groups that had a female teacher, the girls in the groups with a female teacher were more likely to carry on studying economics, and it made no difference to the boys. So maybe there's something in the role model. But on the other hand, there's low visibility for women in the natural sciences as well in terms of the talking heads on television. And they still do better in terms of their proportion of female students. So I'm not sure about that explanation. Maybe there's something in it. And we do our best to be role models, those of us who get out there. Some economists say that the imbalance reflects the fact that women on average have different preferences to men. We like novels and paintings, so we choose English literature and art history. Men like money and business, so they choose economics. How patronising is this? Put to one side the fact that economics is about so much more than money and business. The failure of this argument to recognise that people's preferences and choices are shaped by a gender stereotype society means that anybody who puts that argument forward should be immediately banned from any social science practice. So I've knocked down a few potential explanations, and now I have to try and give you what some of the explanations might be. And I think they fall into two categories which are linked to each other. One is about the character of economics, and one is about the sociology of the profession, particularly in universities. So you'll be aware that economics has a lot of critics. They've been very vocal recently, and a lot of the criticisms, in my view, are quite wide of the mark. They tend to say economics is too abstract, too unrealistic, too mathematical, and I think a lot of the people making these kinds of criticisms really aren't aware about how much the subject has changed in the past 20 years and what economists who do research in universities spend their time doing these days. There are some more valid criticisms of the fact that the economics textbooks haven't changed or haven't all kept up with what economists actually do, and they present an unrealistic and oversimplified version of the subject. And there's a bit of truth in that, and I have worked on a new economics curriculum, the core economics curriculum, to try and address that. Although again, you'll find that physics textbooks start with no friction, so you've got to start with the very simplest versions of the subject. But there's something in that. Or the critics will note, and I think correctly, that policymakers and politicians who did their economics 30 years ago haven't kept up and also use what they learned for ideological purposes. And we went through a period with the Thatcher and Reagan revolution of a certain kind of economics dominating. So those are the sort of standard criticisms, but there's one issue, and I haven't seen it articulated very clearly anywhere, and that's about the style that's valued in economics. And I think it helps explain why the subject is in the same league with computer science and physics and philosophy. And that's the immense value that's placed on a certain kind of brilliance. You know, it's genuine brilliance, but it also involves a kind of confidence and public display that almost all girls are socialised out of very early in their studies. Dame Athene Donald, the master of my college in Cambridge, Churchill College, writing about the underrepresentation of girls in physics, has put it this way, that we're described as an admired for being hardworking or conscientious, and when she gets references, that's how the female candidates are described. And that the male candidates will more often be described as the most brilliant student I've ever worked with, a unique talent, and so on. And girls and women who are visibly brilliant pay a price for it in their unpopularity. People don't like it. And I think this segues into the second aspect, the kind of sociology of economics. Because it's relatively isolated from other disciplines, and some scholars argue it's much more hierarchical than other disciplines too. Economists manifest a strong sense of their superiority, which can be underpinned by the fact that often they are much better paid, or they get outside consulting activities, and there's always demand for economists in jobs. Brexit is a great source of demand for economists at the moment. Economics is more insular in very measurable ways. Other disciplines cite economics papers, but economics don't cite other disciplines very much. The individual brilliance is reflected in the fact that economics papers are less often co-authored than in many other social science subjects, even though co-authorship is on the increase. It is not a surprise to learn from this research that co-authorship acts against women. When men in American university departments get tenure, so they've got their job for life then, it's regardless of whether the papers that they've written are single-authored or co-authored. Women are half as likely to get tenure full stop in economics departments, and they're less likely still if the papers they've written are co-authored. And when men and women co-author together, it's assumed that the work's been done by the man. And the same research found that this is not the case in other social sciences like sociology. Women are more likely than men to co-author, and they are more likely to pick a senior male to co-author with. And one explanation is that this is seen to be less risky, possibly because women have different risk preferences, they're more risk averse, but also possibly because women just know that they're going to face a much more hostile environment for getting their papers published, which is what matters. You've got to get papers published to get promoted and get tenured. Once you're in economics, there's even more gender sorting, and there are very few women who specialise in the more abstract areas, more amenable to that kind of brilliance, the macroeconomics, how the economy as a whole works, finance, economic theory, econometrics. And female economists are much more likely to specialise in the applied bits, health economics, education, economic development. So the former areas, they're more fruitful if you want to demonstrate that you're a genius. The latter, much more likely to involve teamwork and collaboration with other disciplines. And often those economists will end up, more often they will end up in non-economics departments like geography or education. So all of these factors combine to make what can be quite a brutal everyday culture in economics departments. And it's not that our male colleagues are hostile, far from it. They're very well-meaning. There's very little crude misogyny on display in modern universities at all. But But I think that language I read out at the start from economics job market rumours is not an accident. Very few grown-up male economists would dream of using such language themselves, but they have colluded in an atmosphere that patronises female colleagues and makes young male economists feel it's okay to use that kind of language. The minority feels authorised to say those sorts of things because it's an exaggerated version of some of the things they observe. So take an economics seminar, to an extent unimaginable in any other field whose seminars I've attended. These are hostile occasions. It's about point scoring and aggressive challenge. Presenters will hardly ever get to the end of their first slide without being interrupted. And you see the alpha males in the department doing all of that, sitting in the front row, and the junior colleagues and the women sit at the back saying hardly a word. So there's a huge premium on that kind of confidence and bombast. And this sexism is really deeply embedded institutionally. Papers written by women are routinely held to higher standards, they have to be rewritten more often, they take longer to get published. In an academic world where publication is everything for career prospects. So the work that women do publish is better, but it takes them far longer to get the publications they need to progress their careers. Peer review, fundamental to scholarship, rewards peers, and they're mainly men. Reviewers are always anonymous, but authors are not always anonymous. To amplify the institutional sexism, economics has a really unusually narrow funnel for career progression. So all academic disciplines promote people and reward people essentially on the basis of their research. You never hear of people getting poached by universities because they're such a fabulous teacher. Although if they did, it turns out that female lecturers get systematically worse ratings from students than male lecturers. But some academic journals carry more weight than others, and in economics there are only 5 that really count. And they are general journals. They don't specialise in the applied fields in which women economists tend to congregate, and competition to get a paper into one of them is extraordinarily intense. This then interacts with the general failure of academic institutions to understand that caring for a baby takes more than 1 year, or 2 years if you're lucky. The allowance made for childbirth takes no account of the fact that 3-year-olds are also quite time-consuming. We've certainly moved on, and I don't want to paint too gloomy a picture. I think we can do something about all of this. We've moved on from the days when Paul Samuelson, who wrote a best-selling foundational economics textbook in 1948, wrote in his textbook, "There are always a few women and soapbox orators who are longer on intuition than brains." He was admonished many years later by a female student who wrote to him in 1970, saying, this is false and unfair. He said, "You're absolutely right, mea culpa. Do study economics. Perhaps the best economist in the world also happens to be a woman, Joan Robinson. There are too few women in this profession." So he acknowledged he'd been wrong. And over the time since 1970, things have improved. It was fewer than 10% of female students in economics departments in 1970. But we haven't moved far enough, and I don't think there's any arguing with those figures that you heard from both Sarah and me. There's no intrinsic reason why any subject, but especially social science, only 1 in 5 of its practitioners are women. And economics departments and the professional societies and employers of economists need to tackle this, and they need to do it now, and there's no excuse. So, what should they do? What should a well-meaning department head or president of the Royal Economic Society do about all of this? And one place to look for some lessons is the Government Economic Service. Hello to GES friends in the audience. My first job was in the Treasury in the mid-1980s, and I pitched up with my freshly minted PhD, rather full of myself. And in those days, papers were circulated around to people with a list of all those who were supposed to read them at the top. And they were listed as Mr., Mrs. or Miss. And as a stroppy feminist, I said, "I want to be Ms. Can I be Ms. Coyle, please?" And my head of department said, "No, we don't do things that way." So I said instead, "Could I be listed as Dr. Coyle, please?" And there were only 2 PhDs in our division, as myself and my boss, and she joined my small rebellion. So for a while, there were 2 doctors and lots of misters on the circulation list. But it won't surprise you to learn I didn't last very long in the Treasury hierarchy. GES is now, Government Economic Service is now pretty much the best employer for women economists, at least in the sense that 30% of them are women. And this proportion has increased over time, and it's been thanks to a sustained, long-term, broader civil service effort to address the institutional biases women faced at work. It's included easier part-time working, job shares, paternity leave campaigns to make sure men take time off to take part in childcare, and a whole range of things that make the workplace more welcoming for women. It's involved really high-profile leadership from some of the men, Gus O'Donnell and Martin Donnelly, for example. But even given these changes in that wider civil service environment, the Government Economic Service is going to have to work harder, given that the pipeline of female graduates looks like it might be shrinking. So what could be done more broadly? And I think part of the answer is sustained leadership, and from men. Every department head, every chief economist in the city, leadership of professional bodies are all going to have to indicate by what they say and what they do that this is a priority for them. And although I've been talking about women in economics, the same point applies to people who are not white and not middle class. Because the subject is not only male-dominated, it's pretty posh, and people from other ethnic backgrounds are underrepresented too. And increasingly it's private schools that are teaching economics, putting it on their pupils' radar, while state schools are increasingly opting for business studies. But to repeat myself, a social science that gets too far adrift from its society will be failing to ask important questions, will be failing to gather important evidence, will lose legitimacy, and ultimately will make itself irrelevant. So I think it's time for the high-profile leaders of the economics profession to take the representation question really seriously. And for the most part, they haven't done so. They've paid lip service, and the senior men still don't take it seriously enough. We can now look forward to welcoming Rachel Griffiths, former colleague of mine at Manchester and the Institute of Fiscal Studies, as only the second ever female president of the Royal Economic Society, and I'm sure that she will make a difference. But I think different outcomes are going to require some quite contentious changes in the institutions of the academic profession, where the papers are published, how the peer review gets done, how research funding operates. And tackling institutional bias is always controversial. So all professional domains make it hard for young women to progress, and some of the reasons are common, whether it's in the universities or the private sector or the civil service. But I think they could all learn from the civil service example, where there has been progress, about hiring practices, promotion disciplines, working patterns, everyday workplace culture. For economics itself, every economist can be alert to aspects of institutional prejudice that I've been describing and call out certain kinds of behaviour and language. And many still don't, because after all it requires confrontation with your colleagues, and that's pretty uncomfortable. As an economist though, I can't help thinking that the best lever is going to be the money, and there's no insuperable reason that 7 or 8 out of 10 students doing economics should be male. Those young people are going to become the economists of the future when they graduate. Universities get substantial amounts of taxpayer funding, and taxpayer money can reasonably come attached with some certain minimum standards. I don't think it's any excuse to say only the best research should get funded and published, because to buy that I'd have to believe that women are not as good at researching as men, and I don't believe that. People might also say it's no business of the government to make those kinds of decisions, and I think that's true. But equally, this is not about individual research decisions, it's about the outcomes in terms of who, what kinds of people and what kinds of places get the funding. And I can't see at the moment any alternative to that kind of external lever to force change. But even the least patronising, most female-friendly male economist is complicit in this if their response is that nothing should be done, nothing needs doing. Because the reputation of economics, a decade on now from the crisis, is tarnished. And all the evidence of entrenched discrimination and the lack of diversity is not going to improve that. And in fact, I think it will intensify the criticism. During the Brexit campaign, Anand Menon, who's a political scientist, was part of a roadshow to put some of the relevant social science research evidence to different audiences around the country to help them make up their mind about how to vote in the forthcoming referendum. And he was in the North East talking about the potential impact of the change on GDP, when a woman in the audience heckled him, "That's your bloody GDP, it's not ours." And I think there are already lots of people who think that's your bloody economics and not ours. So this isn't a women problem, it's an economics problem. It's deeply embedded in the discipline's culture and norms, and the profession's senior men need to take it seriously now, because I think it's an existential issue for this subject that I love and have dedicated my life to. So thank you very much, and look forward to the conversation with you about it.